Tak, pozwalam sobie najpierw powiedzieć kilka słów po polsku, bo chciałbym serdecznie podziękować doktorowi Witeckiemu za zaproszenie do Krakowa i za organizację tego wykładu. I też bardzo dziękuję Państwu, że tak licznie przyszliście przy tej świetnej wiosennej pogodzie. Mam nadzieję, że to, co mam do powiedzenia, będzie interesowało wszystkich z Państwa. Więc wykład będzie trwał być może 50 minut, potem będzie dosyć czasu na dwujęzyczną dyskusję i na pytania oczywiście. Okay, back to English now. So, as this first slide reminds us, the topic of my talk today is the entangled history of serfdom in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth during the last decades of its existence in the 18th century. And I would like to introduce this topic to you through the story of one encounter between a solitary hiker and a group of peasants. So this encounter may have happened sometime in the 1770s or 80s, probably somewhere near Piła, which was then on the border between Poland and Brandenburg, Prussia. We don't actually know for sure that it happened at all, because we don't know if it corresponded to an actual experience of the man who wrote about it. And that's him. Well, dlaczego nic nie zdarzy się, kiedy kliknę? Teraz, dobrze. So Stanisław Staszic, one of the great writers and politicians of the Polish Enlightenment. The book in which he described this encounter was the anonymously published Remarks on the Life of Jan Zamoyski, which appeared around 1787, so it was one of the major wake-up calls for reform ahead of the Great Sejm of 1788 to 92. In the penultimate chapter of the book, which was simply entitled Polska, Staszic recalls living close to the border. He was actually born in Piła, and he climbed a hill to take in the beauties of the landscape. He writes, "The breath of Polish air seemed freer to me, and the wind blowing from there carried something lovely. The sky above his country was cleaner and brighter, the trees and meadows greener, the shepherds happier, even the peasant behind his plow goaded his oxen on more energetically." So he's evoking here this idyllic impression of the homeland as a place of freedom and joy and harmony. But then he spots a group of families with their livestock coming toward him from the Polish side. He runs down the hill to greet them, and his joy dissipates quickly because they tell him they are fleeing the Rzeczpospolita for these reasons: that they had bad lords who have not granted them any justice, that the Polish peasant pays more taxes than the foreign peasant, that abroad people of their estate receive justice, protection, and security in their possessions. So Staszic sorrowfully spoke to them, but who will you complain to if they don't keep that promise? A few of them spoke up. In this country, and there they mean Prussia, only one monarch can break a promise he has given us. In Poland, every nobleman can. And Staszic says he did not have a reply. So he generates a rhetorical effect by juxtaposing this idea of Polish free air and Polish golden freedom with this particular reality of unfreedom from which these peasants are trying to escape. And again, we don't know if maybe he embellished this conversation or made it up, But what's important is that he chose to tell the story in his book, and also that the story draws our attention to the border. The border is a place where perspectives from the outside and the inside constantly meet and interact, and where people themselves also move between positions of insider and outsider. So that's the way that I want to look at serfdom in this lecture, a way that crosses and interweaves internal and external perspectives. So a little more concretely, I will obviously be talking about Małopolska, Wielkopolska, Lithuania, and so on, but also about Russia, about Rome, and even about the Caribbean. And in doing so, I hope to tell you 2 or 3 things you didn't know about Polish serfdom yet, even though I'm sure all of you have studied this topic at some point. And perhaps some of you have read some of these recent, relatively well-known books proposing a people's history of Poland, and that history, at the center of this history is the condition of ordinary people, especially peasants under serfdom, and their struggle for freedom and dignity. And I'm not here to tell a people's history of Poland. I'm not here to tell, I'm just an outsider myself in a way, and not telling anybody what matters most about the Polish past, but instead I'm asking one distinct question that I would like to consider, and that is, how did these issues of peasant subjection and unfree labor connect the Rzeczpospolita to the rest of Europe in the 18th century? So that is the question, and in trying to answer it, I have basically divided the lecture into 4 parts, which you can see here. So I'll give a very brief summary of what I see as the major characteristics of early modern serfdom, broadly conceived, and then I'll go into the 3 sort of arenas of entanglement that I want to talk about. The first one being border crossing of state borders by runaway peasants. The second one, the issue of competition between different churches and how the issue of serfdom sort of interacted with that. And then point number 4 here would be the relationship, or the perceived relationship, between serfdom and slavery in the 18th century, and the relevant debates about reform or even abolition of these structures of unfreedom. And then obviously I'll give a short conclusion. All right, now, just some groundwork, about what was early modern serfdom. And again, I assume that many of you already know a great deal about the history of serfdom. So for those of you for who this is the case, I just hope you'll take my short general remarks as reminders. And with that in mind, I want to touch on 3 major characteristics of early modern serfdom in East Central Europe. The first one would be extensive forced labor by peasants on the manors or estates of their lords. The second, severe restrictions on peasants' mobility. And then the third, the ability of lords to exercise a pretty tight judicial and administrative control over their peasant subjects. So I think these would have to be 3 important elements of any definition of early modern serfdom. And some of these elements actually started already to take shape and coalesce in the later Middle Ages. But since this lecture is focused on the 18th century, I'm not going to tackle the question of how and when and why serfdom came into being in the first place. So instead, I'll say a few more words about these 3 basic elements. And the first one is the forced labor of serfed peasants, which in Anglophone scholarship is usually designated by a French word, corvée. While these peasants had their own plots of land that they worked, corvée was the kind of work that they had to do on the Vollbach, around the manor of the Lord, for the Lord's exclusive benefit. And that could include harvesting grain, but also frequently a kind of forced labor that was often done by women was spinning yarn or bleaching cloth. And there were other kinds of forced labor, like transporting grains to the market, night watch at the manor, etc. And over the course of the early modern period, these folwarki tended to get bigger because the domestic and foreign markets that they produced for overall also became larger. Second, in addition to the forced labor, peasants were also afflicted, or many of them were afflicted by forced immobility. So they were tied to the land. They did not have the right to leave the estate without usually some payment to the Lord and also permission from the Lord. They could not just marry somebody from another village without permission. So moving between manors could not just be done without the consent of the Lord. And because they were tied to the land, when Lord sold land to somebody else, the peasants would sort of be sold with the land. Only in extreme cases would peasants be sold without land, which gets us closer to the territory of actual of slavery as we know it from the Atlantic world. And then the third point is this oversight and tight control by the landlords. I mean, there were many different kinds of lords, from petty nobility to powerful magnates owning dozens of villages. There were monasteries, bishoprics, there were royal domains. But by and large, no matter what kind of landlord, by the 16th century, they all held pretty far-reaching rights of legal control over the peasants who inhabited the villages. And very broadly, that meant that if a peasant was accused of any kind of legal offense, he or she would be brought to trial at the local lord's court, the San Patrimoniale. And lords and their estate managers also had the right to police peasants' corvée and mete out punishments if a peasant did not carry out the work as ordered. So there was this legal dependency of peasants, which made it hard for them to seek recourse against the Lord if the Lord committed some kind of injustice. In some of the states and principalities that bordered on Poland-Lithuania, there was a possibility for peasant communities to bring grievances and court cases against lords to a higher up state institution. That sometimes worked in Brandenburg, for example, not so frequently in the Rzeczpospolita. And in Muscovy, it was almost impossible. Now, when we look at Poland-Lithuania specifically, there's one more thing that is worth noting, which is that serfdom doesn't look the same everywhere, and doesn't have the same importance in every region. It was, for example, relatively unimportant in Royal Prussia. So in part, that was due to the fact that you had larger cities, a bunch of larger cities there, like Gdańsk and Toruń. And so peasants could easily sort of evade the countryside and go to these cities, and that kind of lessened the stranglehold of the landlords. Also, parts of present-day Belarus were where these big agricultural Slovakia were not very developed. there also you didn't have that much corvée. And then it just kind of sometimes depended on individual landlords and estate managers, how they handled the situation. So the reason I'm stressing this is because the first main sort of part that I'm talking about now is runaway serfs, and running away makes sense when not that far away from your home village, there is a place that might offer much better conditions, right? So runaway serfs, this issue was a major one throughout the early modern period, and whether in Poland or other countries with a history of serfdom. And so large numbers of insurgent peasants tried to run away. We don't know exactly how many. We don't have statistics for this time period. But based on the evidence that we do have, it is plausible to assume that in the 18th century alone, perhaps several hundreds of thousands of peasants in Poland-Lithuania were or became runaways. Like I said, many of those went to towns, but probably the majority did not actually try to escape serfdom and the countryside completely. Instead, the opportunity they saw was precisely that in another village, working and living conditions might be significantly better. And that could be, that other village could be nearby, it could be in a different voivodstvo, or it could be in a different country. And that's what I want to say a bit more about. These escapes across state borders. And those happened in many different directions. Here, this is just kind of a selection from Brandenburg and East Prussia into the Rzeczpospolita and the other way around, from northwestern Russia into the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, from Greater and Lesser Poland to Silesia, and the other way around, and also in both ways across the border between Poland and what is today Slovakia. So back then part of the Kingdom of Hungary. So unsurprisingly, this is mostly an issue of border regions. But in these regions, the problem could be massive from the perspective of landlords and state authorities. So for example, according to one estimate in the late 1780s, within just 2 or 3 years, 7,000 peasants fled from Wielkopolska to Prussian Silesia. Why? Because the Prussian lords promised them greater freedoms and also individual payments of some money as a reward for this particular kind of migration. So across borders, lords competed for the peasant labor force. And in the border, and this competition then became a competition between states to some extent, because they didn't want, the states had an interest in not losing any of their labor force and any of their population from an economic point of view. There was also a military aspect, you know, when times of warfare and rebellion, peasants could also flee massively. For example, during the War of the Bab Confederation in 1768, a lot of peasants fled from Ruthenia into Moldavia, Crimea, and other regions, and obtained permission to settle there. Now, the landlords who were losing peasants in this way were obviously usually infuriated and tried to get their serfs back. So, for example, they would send out search parties. They went to court proclaiming that the runaways had violated their personal legal duties of obedience and ruptured their ties to the land. And these landlords also tried to mobilize the state apparatus in their favor, with the goal of having border crossing runaways extradited, so having them returned by force to the country that they had fled. And other than army deserters, runaway serfs were the main groups targeted by most extradition efforts in this part of Europe at the time. And these attempts to arrive at mutual extradition agreements were quite common, but they didn't always come to fruition. So here's an example actually from the later 17th century, which in turn, so this is from the context of the Sejm of 1677. It's about relationships between the Rzeczpospolita and Ducal Prussia. And it already refers back to previous commissions with the Duchy of Prussia for the soothing of tensions that arise from the proximity of neighborhood. And these commissions have not been able to take place. And then there's a passage where they blame the other side for that. And therefore, the citizens of our states have suffered ever greater damage as neighborly justice has not been served with regard to lands, borders, forests, and runaway serfs. So again, there is this kind of hope that through an extradition agreement, these tensions could be resolved. And so the Sejm ordered another bilateral commission, but it's also not clear whether that one was more successful than the previous ones because there were many more commissions and negotiations and conflicts throughout the 18th century. In fact, the issue not only persisted throughout the 18th century, but it actually became in some ways even more sensitive in the time of Stanisław August, the last king. And the main reason for that is that the Russian Empress Catherine II, starting in the 1760s, became pretty preoccupied with this issue of serfs fleeing from Russia to the Rzeczpospolita. The border had been pretty constant, had not really changed since the late 17th century, but it was still not officially delimited. It was sinuous, kind of zigzaggy, and hard to control, which made things a lot easier for a peasant who wanted to flee across the border. And then usually the lords on the Polish and Lithuanian side would keep these peasants and would not return them to the Russian side. And that meant that the nobles in Western Russia had huge grievances and complaints. In one commission of 1767 that was carried out in all of the districts, there were 14 Russian districts along the border, and every one of these district instructions mentioned the problem of runaway serfs as a major issue. And one instruction stated that whole villages of Russian peasants sometimes would just pack and flee to Poland. And the one from Smolensk put the total number of fugitives from that district alone at 50,000, which again, they had some interest in exaggerating the problem, but it is clear that it was a major problem. Even after the first partition, which, as you know, happened in 1772, and which simplified this border, but still thousands of serfs managed to cross it and sneak into Poland-Lithuania, to the point where in 1783, there was a new wave of complaints from Russian landowners, and then the Russian government actually started a military expedition into Lithuanian territory to bring back many of these fugitive peasants, and also to intimidate the Polish lords who were protecting them. At the same time, Russia also increased the diplomatic pressure so that the Polish Permanent Council, the Rada Nieustająca, would issue public letters saying to the state officials in the borderlands, you have to quell this movement, you have to punish the lords who refuse to extradite Russian peasants. But again, these measures probably had mixed results. There were three letters within a year, which makes you think that at least the first two were not very effective. So to conclude this first part, we can say that peasant flight across state borders was a significant issue in early modern East Central Europe, and it affected the Rzeczpospolita in both directions. So, in terms of both influx and emigration. In addition, it was not just a social and economic sort of local issue for lords and villagers in the borderlands, because it repeatedly turned into a source of international legal and diplomatic tensions. Now to the second area of entanglement. And entanglement can mean interaction and mutual influence across some kind of boundary. And that boundary doesn't have to be a state boundary. It can also be a cultural boundary, for example, between different churches. And that is what I want to talk about now. Because, as you know, there were many different religious communities in the Rzeczpospolita. And we can now look at the mobility of runaway peasants within the Rzeczpospolita also. Again, it was a large part of it was to the cities, but another big part of it was to one of the most religiously diverse parts, and that was the Ruthenian voivodeships of present-day Western Ukraine. Why did peasants go there? Because these were large spaces of agricultural colonization in the early modern period, where landowning nobles were often very desperate to attract more peasants and offered them also more favorable conditions, at least initially. And then after some time, these peasants would maybe lose some of their rights again. But regardless of that, there was a steady movement of peasants, often runaway serfs, mostly from what is today southern and southeastern Poland, to these Ruthenian regions, which meant that the makeup of the population of these regions was also changing. For centuries, there had been an Orthodox Christian and Ruthenian majority living in these southeastern parts of the Rzeczpospolita, along with a significant Jewish minority. And then the situation becomes more complicated progressively in the 17th and 18th century. And at the end of the 16th century, you have the Church Union of Brest, where a part of the Eastern Church became the so-called Uniate Church, meaning that it kept the Eastern liturgy and customs and rites, but it accepted the Catholic doctrine and the spiritual government of the Pope in Rome. Now you have the diocese, the diocesan territories of the Union. And initially in the 17th century, this church was strongest actually in Lithuania and also in the area around Kilian, and much less so in the Ukrainian parts, but that changed around 1700. So at that moment, you have the previously Orthodox bishoprics of Przemysl, Lwów, and also switching over to the Union. And that meant that you had thousands of Uniate parishes now in these regions, mixed in with some peasants that remained Orthodox. There was greater Orthodox population still further east. And then, like I said, you get this influx of peasants who were from the primarily Roman Catholic parts further west. So that's how you get a very mixed and religiously diverse population. And how does that play out with regard to serfdom? I just want to answer that question now with regard to the relationship between the Uniate and the Roman Catholic Church. So first, I'm going to look at peasants switching from the Roman Catholic to the Uniate side, and then I'll also say a little bit about the other way around. So as for right switching from Roman to Uniate, I found I felt very lucky to find a really interesting document in the Vatican 2 years ago. It's a letter by the bishop, the Roman Catholic bishop of Kamieniec Podolski, Mikołaj Dębowski, who wrote in 1756 to the papal curia, and he wrote about the fertility of the soil in this Ruthenian part of the Rzeczpospolita, and said that it has caused the local population to be steadily increased by those who come here continuously from the heart of Poland and who change their family names along with their rights. So going over to the Uniate side, due to the convenience of Uniate parishes or Uniate churches existing in every village, and the greater freedom they find in the Uniate rite, and lastly, in order to evade the efforts of lords who search for them based on the law of serfdom. So basically, these peasants are going incognito, trying not to be found by the lords who are, based back in further west. And Dębowski then claims this is an extremely weighty grievance affecting the kingdom no less than the Latin rite. So this is just one document, but other research and other sources show that this was a larger trend, in fact, that also already existed for quite a while before the mid-18th century. A kind of cultural assimilation where peasants would take on a Ruthenian identity and at the same time sort of try to shake off the condition of serfdom. And as you can see, certain spiritual authorities who were losing Roman Catholic souls were not happy about that. There were other entanglements like this, for example, marriages between individuals who were both Catholic, but of two different rites. So one of the partners would be Roman Catholic and the other would be Uniate. And frequently one partner then switched to the rite of the other, but not necessarily or automatically. So you have these everyday interactions, and then you have people complaining and worrying about them. And then in the later 18th century, there's an additional development that again involves not so much the clergy, but the noble landlords, who are also trying to intervene more in these relations between Uniate and Roman Catholicism. The landlords themselves were overwhelmingly Roman Catholic by that time, and often controlled villages in which most of the unserved peasants were not Roman Catholic, but Uniate. And that was particularly the case in these very approximately demarcated contact zones between those two Catholic churches. So one in present-day southern and southeastern Lithuania and neighboring parts of Belarus, and the other one in those Ruthenian lands around Lviv and Kamieniec that I just talked about. And I'm going to actually take an example from the contact zone that I haven't talked about, so the Belarusian one, to illustrate what I mean when I say that these lords intervened in the Uniate sort of life of their of serfs. So actually, I don't have a slide for that, but in February of 1786, an assembly of nobles from the voivodeship of Minsk petitioned the Pope again to allow them to impose Roman Catholicism on all of their Ruthenian serfs. And this was a pretty influential group of petitioners, including two judges named Kilian and Stanisław Pruszyński. And Stanisław Pruszyński stands out because he'd already gone a step further. He had founded a new Roman Catholic parish in two of his villages with the consent of the local a Roman Catholic bishop of Vilnius. And then he had compelled the Uniate villagers in those settlements to join the Roman Catholic parish. And then he also sent a separate letter to Rome complaining about the Uniate clergy who were protesting against this kind of mass conversion, if you will. And the Uniate clerical hierarchy was, in fact, quite worried about this potentially very dangerous precedent. So in early 1788, the Uniate Bishop Teodosy Stotsky reported after a trip through Lithuania that I very frequently heard nobles threatening to order their serfs to switch rights. And they were only waiting to see what will happen between us and the Pruszynskis, whose deed is known to almost all of Lithuania. And that raises the question, why all this fuss about right switching, and why were lords trying to do that? Now, I mean, the mixture of rights and rural populations had existed for quite a while. And so the answer to why that is happening now, I think, has at least two components. The first one being that we are in the time of the partitions here, obviously, and the Rzeczpospolita is weakened. It's facing constant pressure and interference, especially from Russia, which fosters a kind of climate where many in the Szlachta are upset about Russian Orthodoxy. And many then questioned if maybe they're Uniate peasants who, as a reminder, initially were also part of the Eastern Church and still had the Eastern customs and liturgy and so on, were actually sort of secretly still Orthodox rather than Catholic. And that suspicion was one that Roman Catholics often directed against Uniates. And the second part of why they did this, it has to do with the Enlightenment. Because the Enlightenment placed a lot of emphasis on a well-functioning and productive rural economy with a peasantry that was healthy and numerous and hardworking. That was sort of the ideal economic picture. And what these lords were now claiming is that peasants could be healthier and more hardworking if they were Roman Catholics. Because the Uniates had, like I said, they have a different liturgy and a different calendar. They have more holidays. They have stricter fasts. So the idea is that if we switch our peasants, our insurgent peasants, over to the Roman Catholic side, we'll actually do them a favor because they'll become healthier. They won't fast themselves to death anymore. And they'll also become more productive, which will benefit both them and, of course, us, the lords ourselves. So that was kind of in line with the principles of the Enlightenment, at least according to this logic. So to summarize this part, we have this theme of right switching that goes in both directions. And it often sparks these conflicts between churches that are related to serfdom and the inequality between peasants and lords. And also the peasants' attempts to escape serfdom, for example, by moving to other parts of the Rzeczpospolita. Okay. Last main part, reform and abolition. So, so far I've talked primarily about the entanglements that resulted when serfs fled and moved around, or the local conflicts that involved different churches. But freedom and unfreedom wasn't just something that these peasants were trying to sort of navigate, but it was also the stuff of pretty heated political and ideological debates among elites across Europe. And we saw a glimpse of that with Staszic in the beginning. The Enlightenment becomes a major intellectual current in that period, and it promotes the value of freedom in new ways, notably in one, by emphasizing the liberty of the human individual, and two, by developing the idea that there is or should be a kind of social contract that makes the legitimacy of a government dependent on the consent of the people that are being governed. So that's this emphasis, which is not, of course, entirely new, but it does have these new qualities and this new insistence, means that much of the politics of the 18th century and also the 19th century was dominated by a struggle to figure out whether this idea about individual liberty in particular should actually apply to everybody, including serfs and slaves. And if so, how to make their liberation happen. And different versions of this problem came up for each European state, but also for non-European states, of course, like the newly founded United States of America. And what I'd like to suggest is that the Rzeczpospolita was entangled in these larger discussions in three sort of ways. The first and the broadest one is this relationship between serfdom and slavery and how it was perceived in the 18th century. And the second one, how Polish political elites and writers were in dialogue with thinkers from other countries about this topic of serfdom in particular. And then the third aspect will be a brief look at the Constitution of May 3rd, 1791, and its sort of transnational implications for the peasantry and peasants' freedom. So, serfdom and slavery existed in separate parts of the world. If we think of slavery as primarily the enslavement of the Black people in the Atlantic world. But some of these Polish historians, whose books I showed you in the beginning, have argued that Polish serfdom was pretty much so bad that it should be considered a form of slavery. And one of the points that they make to support this argument is that 18th century people themselves, both Poles and others, often classified, they called serfs basically slaves. So for example, Frederick II, the Prussian, famous Prussian king in 1754 wrote about, quote, the slavery of serfdom that still is common in Pomerania. End of quote. And Western travelers coming to Poland also often claimed that unserved peasants in the Rzeczpospolita were actually slaves. And in addition, it was common to compare the misery of Central and Eastern European serfs to that of enslaved Black people in the Americas. So one Polish example would be the writer Kajetan Węgierski, who visited, he first went to Paris from Poland, and then he visited the French slave colonies in the Caribbean in 1783. And there, and seeing that, he wrote that, quote, "It seems to me that under a reasonable master, the Black slaves should be pitied less than the peasants of Russia, Poland, or Hungary." So we have all of this rhetorical sort of mingling of slavery and serfdom in the way that 18th century people themselves talked about these things. What did that mean exactly? It did not mean that many people thought that the legal and personal situation of enslaved peasants was identical to that of enslaved Black people. And Węgierski, if you think about the quote, did not really claim that, actually. He made a comparison, but to compare two things is not necessarily to say that there are no significant differences between them, right? And many European writers also use the word slavery often loosely. just referring to any kind of unfreedom or any kind of suffering from unjust or despotic power. So we cannot simply assume that people in the 18th century understood a word like niewolnik or equivalents in other languages in the exact same way that we do today. But there is still this overlap, and this rhetorical overlap between slavery and serfdom in the 18th century. And that had consequences. It meant that if you criticize the one, you would also undermine the legitimacy of the other. And there is, of course, by the late 18th century, an emerging current of abolitionism with regard to slavery. You have the historian Guillaume Renal on the French side, kind of writes an abolitionist history of what he called the Indies. So that would include the Americas in the understanding of the time. On the British side, you have the famous autobiography of Olaudah Equiano, who had been a slave and then gained his freedom and emigrated to or migrated to Britain, and there wrote this much publicized autobiography. And then you have a legal case also in England in 1772, where the judge, Lord Mansfield, says there cannot be slavery on English soil, meaning the island, not the colonies, but the European island of Great Britain cannot have slaves. And part of the reason why it cannot is that it also cannot even have serfs. That was kind of part of his argument. So again, you see this link. So you have this problem of legitimacy. Now, how to reform the conditions and the lives of peasants and potentially even abolish serfdom. That was a problem for the elite in Poland-Lithuania, that they, especially the part that approved of the Enlightenment, that they would often sort of discuss with other European elites. There were the large-scale attempts to actually implement such a reform failed. In Poland, the most famous example being the rejection of the Zamoyski Code by the Sejm of 1780. But the discussion about the topic went on and on. And there was a lot of back and forth, again, between the Rzeczpospolita and other countries. The most famous outside advice coming from the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his Considerations on the Government of Poland, which he wrote in a direct dialogue with delegates of the Bar Confederation between 1770 and 1772. And then later, around the time of the Great Sejm, Rousseau's treatise would also be translated into Polish and gain more publicity in Warsaw. Now, on the question of serfdom, Rousseau's advice was pretty ambiguous. I sense the difficulty of the project of freeing your common people. I am afraid not merely of the badly understood self-interest, the self-conceit, and the prejudices of the masters. If these were surmounted, I should also fear the vices and the cowardice of the serfs. The idea being that the serfs themselves couldn't actually handle their freedom if they were granted. So it was the right thing, liberating them was the right thing to do in theory, but probably too dangerous in practice, according to Rousseau. But there were also more enthusiastic voices for reform or abolition of serfdom in the Rzeczpospolita. And these voices also were embedded in a wider European space. What I mean by that is, for example, you have a Jesuit publication, the Kalendarz Warszawski, which in 1765 demands the liberation of ordinary farmers from serfdom. uwolnienia rolników prostego stanu poddaństwa, and justified this demand by pointing out that another great philosopher of the Enlightenment, Montesquieu, had demonstrated the harm that the institution of serfdom did to politics and to the economy. So there's these cross references. And another strategy for Polish and Lithuanian reformers was to contrast the misery of serfdom with the relative freedom of French peasants, who were supposedly so much happier, healthier, and more productive. And here again, you get these ideals that I already talked about. Also, some people pointed to the Swiss as the model of a free nation with a free peasantry. And what all these different cases show is that serfdom as a topic of philosophical and political concern sort of kept spilling over the borders of the Rzeczpospolita and arousing the curiosity of people like Rousseau, and in the other direction, then also the discussion in Poland-Lithuania received impulses from outside. All of that came to a head, of course, with the Great Sejm of 1788-92, and in large part with the Constitution of May 3rd. Article 2 of that Constitution cements the social and political dominance of the Szlachta, of course, but Article 4 did focus on improving the status of the peasantry. So let's look at it. So here it talks about how the peasantry is the most numerous, and also in a way the part that gives the greatest strength to the country. So it has to be accepted under the protection of the law and of the national government. And then there are some guidelines on contracts that should be made between lords and peasants to exclude arbitrary exercise of power. And then the last part of this article says, every person newly arrived from any part abroad or returning to the states of the Commonwealth, as soon as he set foot upon Polish soil, is completely free to use his industry as and where he will. He's free to make agreements, etc., and is free to reside in Poland or to return to whichever country he wish. So any peasant entering the territory of the Rzeczpospolita was free, whether entering for the first time or coming back after, for example, having fled the country previously. So we're back where I started with this topic of peasants moving across borders and how that becomes a political issue. Here, we see it not so much from the perspective of the peasants trying to find a better life, but rather how an enlightened government sort of tries to use that. I don't know. I didn't include the part where it kind of explains why. It just wants to have a bigger population. People drafting this constitution just thought that it would be good to attract peasants, strengthening the economy, and that offering them freedom in this way was a good way of doing it. So again, obviously the neighboring states were not happy with that. I mean, there were other reasons, and this is not why the second partition happened, but it is one sort of factor of tension once again. So again, you have this interlacing of the history of Poland-Lithuania with these other European histories of peasant freedom and unfreedom. All right, very quick conclusion. So very briefly recapitulating, we have this territorial aspect, the border crossing, which often had political and diplomatic repercussions, especially in the 18th century, because of this asymmetry of power between Poland-Lithuania and the neighboring states. Second, the religious dimension, the religious diversity, and how serfdom is a kind of an issue of conflict that maps onto the religious diversity. And third, the dimension of political and social thinking about serfdom in the Age of Enlightenment, where you had writers across Europe and in the slaveholding societies of the Americas who were rethinking what liberty meant, some of whom were increasingly critical of serfdom as well as slavery, and all of them engaged in this debate on these forms of unfreedom. So serfdom is, of course, a quintessential part and topic of Polish national history, but we should also see it as a topic that can make us think about early modern Polish and Lithuanian entanglements with the rest of Europe and the world. Thank you very much for listening.